Hello, my name is Bree, and I'd like to welcome you to my channel, Breezy Banter, the place where I talk about the things I want to talk about. In today's video, I want to do a media roundup of the most notable books, movies, TV shows, and video games that I've consumed over the past few months. I am a relatively heavy consumer of media, so although I don't watch that much TV, I do watch quite a number of movies and I read a ton. And I would say I'm a fairly regular video game player. And on top of that, I also take a great deal of pride of doing my reviews once I've completely finished whatever it is I'm consuming. So by that, I mean that if I'm telling you my review of a video game, it means that I am telling you it once I've fully completed it. Same thing with books. And I'll just state up front that of the media that I'm going to be talking about today, none of it is notable for a particularly bad reason. That's not necessarily always the case, because when it comes to TV, video games, and movies, I am quite picky. And so if somebody recommends to me a movie that doesn't have good reviews or doesn't seem to be particularly promising, I'm not all that inclined to watch it or play it. That said, when it comes to books, I take a very different approach, and I will read literally anything that is recommended to me. And there's a variety of reasons for that. I'm sure I've talked about it in some other videos, but what that means is that sometimes I read things that aren't my cup of tea. It's relatively rare that that happens. Most people aren't out here giving me recommendations for like the worst media to consume, but sometimes a friend might just be off the mark with a particular recommendation. All of that to say, that didn't happen over these past few months, so I'm really going to be focusing on media that was noteworthy for other reasons. So with all of that said, let's get into the media that I've been consuming and, for the most part, enjoying. So I haven't watched any new TV, at least as far as I'm aware. So I don't have any new TV to talk about. As I mentioned, I just don't watch a lot of TV, so that's not uncommon per se. In terms of video games, there are two that I wanted to mention. The first is a absolutely lovely game called Crypt Custodian. And this video game is game 3 that was developed by a solo dev. His name is Kyle Thompson. And I've played his other 2 games, one of which is called Islets and the other is called Sheepo. And I adored those games. Fortunately, that trend continued with this third game, Crypt Custodian. So I'm going to read parts of my review that I made on Steam because I just think it's relevant here, and I'm not going to redo all of my work. One thing that I really want to note about this game is that it felt like it was made by someone who plays games. And if you enjoy playing video games, it's very possible that you've played a game where something happens and you're like, have the devs played games? Like, are they intending to play their own game? Because anyone who's played games would not make this choice. Or sometimes what I find is some devs will make particularly frustrating decisions in their development and then pass that off as difficulty. And that's not the type of difficulty that I might be looking for when I play a game. What doesn't feel fair is if you play a game and there's, 30 minutes without a save point, and then you get to a boss room and then you die, and then you have to redo 30 minutes of what you just did to get to that same boss room, and then you're probably gonna die. That's the sort of thing that I think really frustrates me, because that's difficult, but it's not enjoyable difficulty. Anyways, all of that being said, Crypt Custodian, along with the developer's other titles, feel like they're made by someone who plays video games and like understands video games, in that there are so many quality of life aspects to the game that if they're not there, they're abundantly clear that they're not there. But if they are there, it's a lot easier to sort of skip over them. But that said, I did notice it. For example, there are save points right outside boss rooms. There's a map that you can add your own pins to for things that you might want to come back and revisit. There's teleportation across the entire map. It's just things like that that make the entire gaming experience so much more enjoyable. On top of that, I think the story is adorable. I think the NPCs that you interact with are very cute. I should say that this is a metroidvania, so it's a like action adventure exploration, very light platforming sort of game. And so it is a metroidvania, and I feel like the metroidvania aspects of the game were very well implemented in that, for example, if I recall, there were 10 different areas, and I'm pretty sure like the first maybe 3 you kind of have to go to in order, but I got to like area 9 I think before I got to area 5, and that just meant that there was a lot of leeway for the player to play the game the way that they wanted to. And as a avid fan of metroidvanias, that was really fun for me. I also found that the boss fights were quite fun. I think all of them took me at least several tries. I played on normal difficulty. There is a hard difficulty and an easy difficulty. Normal difficulty was on the easier end of things, but I also just didn't feel compelled to bump it up to a harder difficulty. I got 100% in-game completion with all achievements except for boss rush ones, with 11.5 hours of gameplay. And so I think if I did go for those 2 remaining achievements, it probably would have added maybe 3 to 5 hours of additional playtime, and it would have been quite the challenge. And then on top of that, after you complete the game, you unlock shuffle mode, which changes the order in which it basically changes where certain abilities that you get throughout the game are placed. And so that means that if you play it again, you won't have the same playthrough that you had in a previous run, because whereas after beating the 3rd boss you were able to do ability A, now you can only do ability B instead. So I think that's also a lot of fun. I will say that I do slightly prefer his second title, Islets, over this one. I think in large part because it's a top-down Metroidvania, and I do just tend to prefer side-scrollers. But all in all, this game was a delight to play. Highly recommend it. It was so good. And especially coming from a solo developer, I think if you played it and didn't know that, you would be shocked to find that out. The next game that I want to talk about is Road 96, which I wasn't expecting to like as much as I did, but it's a narrative-based, choices matter, choose your own adventure type game. The game centers around doing runs, quote unquote, and basically you play as a teenager that's trying to escape a country for reasons that become more clear as you play the game. There's basically political turmoil that's occurring, and there are choices that you make during different interactions with certain characters that then affect your ability to leave. You do several runs and you meet the same characters during those different runs, and so you learn more about the characters as well. And it was really interesting because what that meant was you might think that you're making a particularly good decision during one interaction with this person, and then you later find out that during a different interaction with that same person, maybe that person isn't quite who you think they are. And so maybe you would have changed your mind had you had that information during your first interaction. It basically just was quite interesting in that implementation where things just weren't always as they seemed. On top of that, I played the game basically as I would in real life. Like, what is the decision I would make if this was actually happening? I had middling success, which I just thought was an interesting conclusion. And I'll also say that I don't tend to enjoy narrative games all that much. I struggle to really get into them, but this game, like, it drew me in immediately and had my attention all the way to the end. In general, I would say each run, so playing as a particular teenager, took about an hour. You have to do, I think, 6 or 7 runs to like complete a complete game. And then of course you can go back and do it again if you wish. And in general, I loved this game. It was a ton of fun, and I think it would be fun to go back and make different decisions and see how it impacts your success during each run. In terms of movies, I've been watching a bit fewer movies than I normally would, in large part because I've been a bit busier, and I think we're all, like, the releases also just there have been fewer releases of movies that I am interested in. And I think in large part because the bulk of the movies that I tend to enjoy definitely tend to come out during award season, so like fall and maybe gearing up into like festival season, so like spring. And so right now is just kind of that influx time where a lot of the movies that are coming out are like superhero movies, for example. And that's just not generally my thing. But I did see 2 movies that I want to talk about. The first is Didi, which is an absolutely lovely movie. I'm going to read the description here. It says, in 2008, during the last months of summer, during the last month of summer before high school begins, an impressionable 13-year-old Taiwanese American boy learns what his family can't teach him: how to skate, how to flirt, and how to love your mom. And this was just a really sweet film. I think it depicts a lot of the disgruntledness that can happen when you're a kid, a lot of the confusion that can happen when you're a kid, wanting to act a particular way but feeling pressured to act another. And I just thought it was a very sweet story, and it is very well reviewed as well. So I would easily recommend this one to others. The other movie that I watched is I, Tonya, or the other movie that I want to mention is I, Tonya, because I did see more, which is an older film. And the description is: competitive ice skater Tonya Harding rises amongst the ranks at the US Figure Skating Championships, but her future in the sport is thrown into doubt when her ex-husband intervenes. My understanding is this is based on a true story, but it's not like a documentary. It's also kind of funny to me because when I was watching it, there was some scene like 30 minutes into the film and I was like, oh, that looks like Margot Robbie. And I was told that, yes, it is in fact Margot Robbie. Anyways, this was I thought it was an interesting film. The way it's done is a bit different. It's not like a mockumentary. I'm not quite sure of the right word. They basically do like interviews with the people involved, but the focus is really on the flashbacks, I guess. They're not like presented as flashbacks. It's a bit difficult to describe, but all in all, this was a really good drama. There is some comedic bits, but it was a good drama, and I quite enjoyed the acting in the film. Next, in terms of books, I really only had 3 that I wanted to talk about, though 2 of them are series. So I finished 2 manga series, one of which is called Dorohedoro, which my understanding is also a anime. I haven't seen the anime, but like I said, I finished the manga. The description here says, in a city so dismal it's known only as the Hole, a clan of sorcerers has been plucking people off the streets to use as guinea pigs for atrocious experiments in the black arts. In a dark alley, Nikaido found Cayman, a man with a reptile head and a bad case of amnesia. To undo the spell, they're hunting and killing the sorcerers in the Hole, hoping that eventually they'll kill the right one. But when N, the head sorcerer, gets word of a lizard man slaughtering his people, he sends a crew of cleaners into the Hole, igniting a war between 2 worlds. And the reason I wanted to talk about this one is this is a weird manga, for lack of a better word. It's weird, and weird tends to be up my alley. This is weird and dystopian and kind of gritty. I don't know if I would call it horror. Like, I'm looking now on Goodreads and it's under genres, the 3rd genre is horror. I don't know if I would call it horror, but it definitely has just sort of that grittiness to it that I tend to enjoy. And like I said, it's weird in a way that, like, a man with a reptile head, like, that's weird, right? So if you are looking for a manga series that is a little bit out there, a little bit different than what you're probably used to, I would very much recommend this one. For the most part, I rated most of the volumes between 3 stars or 4 stars, so it didn't like blow my socks off or anything, but I did enjoy my read through it. The next series that I finished is called Blood on the Tracks, and again, this is a manga series, and the plot here is Saiki Osabi is a shy middle school student living a relatively ordinary life. His mother, Seiko, is considered overprotective of him by others, although Seichi is comfortable with the love and care from his mother and does not feel anything strange about her behavior. One day, Seichi goes on a family hiking trip with his parents and paternal family. At one point, Seichi's cousin, Shigeru, jokingly pushes Seichi near a cliff edge, leading Seiko to quickly grab hold of Seichi, protecting him from falling. The rest of the family starts laughing at Seiko over her overprotective act. A while later, Seichi and Shigeru go to a higher cliff edge, and when Shigeru is on the cliff edge, Seiko, who was following them, approaches her nephew and pushes him off the cliff, giving a brief smile to her son. After the incident where Shigeru is left in a comatose state and Seichi was the only witness of what happened, he begins to discover how dangerous his mother's affection can become, and what follows is a series of events in which Seichi's everyday life becomes a horror, living under the disturbing protection of his own mother. The reason I want to mention this is the genre here is psychological horror, as you might imagine, and what happened was I read the first volume like several months ago, and then I picked up like the next 3 and I just blew through them. I think I read them like all in the same day, and then I got like the next 10, and I read through them like all 10 in the next day after that. And I literally couldn't stop reading because it was so interesting. And then when I got to what I thought was the end, because for the most part, I don't want to start series that are not concluded. But this one, when I started it, there were 16 out of 17 volumes that had been released. And so I had to wait like 3 more months, I think, for the release of the 17th volume in English. And it finally came out like 2 weeks ago or so. I like picked it up as soon as I could and finished it. It was so good, and it's been a very long time since I've felt compelled to just like not stop reading something. Like I just had to know what happened next. Also, these volumes are brief. I'm not sure of like the right word to put it. There's a less is more approach that I think really amplifies sort of the creepiness and the horror and the loneliness that I think the main character experiences. And so I also really enjoyed it for that. So it's also relatively rare, I think, for mangas to be psychological horrors. There are a handful that I've read over the years, and I feel like I've just kind of always loved them. And this was no different. I think almost every volume, if not every volume, I rated 4 stars. So it's definitely up there in terms of manga that I have enjoyed. And then the last book that I want to talk about is The Hollow Places, which is a horror fantasy novel, which I have a bit of a gripe with. But synopsis here is: a young woman discovers a strange portal in her uncle's house, leading to madness and terror in this gripping new novel. I read this book because I love horror, and I find it's very difficult to find good horror, but this has relatively high ratings on Goodreads for a supposedly horror novel. It was also a nominee for Best Horror in 2020 on the Goodreads website. And I will say, there was a part when reading this that I thought was creepy, and that was it. I was never scared. I certainly did not feel creeped out during like the entirety of the book or a majority of the book. It was fine. And I'm a bit saddened to say that because, like I said, I'm always like, I love horror and I'm looking for good horror. So if you have recommendations, please let me know. And this one, what I can say for it is, to me, it's weird. Kind of like Dorohedoro, but Dorohedoro, although it's, as I mentioned, one of the genres listed was horror, to me, I don't think many people would describe Dorohedoro as horror. Maybe in like a very abstract sense it is, whereas this one is marketed as being like, this is a horror novel. If you read like the people, you know how on like the front or back of a book there will always be someone talking about, like, recommending it. They talk about how scary it is, and it just wasn't. And like, I don't say that as like a stoic person. I didn't find it scary. So that was a bit of a disappointment. I think the book itself is fine. Perhaps if it was marketed different as just like a weird book, then I would have been more into it. But as it stands, it wasn't. And so I wasn't. So I think that's all that I really had to talk about today. I wish I had consumed a bit more media than I had. It is just unfortunate, but like I said, that isn't the entirety of the media that I've consumed. It is just the more notable works. So with all of that in mind, if you enjoyed this video, I hope you'll like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. And I also hope you will consider telling me in the comments what media you've consumed over the past few months that you have really enjoyed that you would recommend to others. And before I go, I'd like to take a minute to thank you for taking time out of your day to spend watching this video. It really means a lot to me. Thank you. Bye.